The stallion refused to move forward, pawing at the desert ground with an urgency that sent chills down his owner's spine. For 3 years, the horse had never disobeyed a command, never shown fear, never acted this strangely. But on this scorching afternoon in 1868, something had changed. When the rancher finally dismounted and followed where the animal's ears were pointed, he discovered a young Apache woman, half buried in sand and mesquite, barely clinging to life, with arrow wounds that told a story of betrayal from her own people. He made a choice that day that defied every law, every social norm, every survival instinct that governed the brutal Arizona frontier. He saved her life, knowing it could cost him everything. What he didn't know was that 12 years later, she would return not as the broken woman he remembered, but as something the territory had never seen before, and what she would reveal about a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of territorial government would shake the foundations of power itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer heat of 1868 pressed down on the Arizona desert like a physical weight, turning the air into something thick and hostile that burned with each breath. Daniel Crawford wiped sweat from his eyes as he guided his stallion Rebel along the rocky trail that connected his isolated ranch to the nearest trading post, 15 miles south. The journey was one he made monthly, trading dried beef and leather goods for supplies he couldn't produce himself. Coffee, ammunition, medical supplies, and the occasional newspaper that arrived months late from San Francisco. Daniel had built his ranch 5 years earlier on land that most settlers considered worthless. Too far from water sources, too close to Apache territory, too exposed to the elements. But Daniel had seen what others missed: a natural spring hidden in a canyon, grazing land that could support a modest herd, and most importantly, isolation from the corrupt territorial officials and land-grabbing cattle barons who made life miserable for small ranchers closer to civilization. At 32, Daniel had already lived several lifetimes. He'd fought in the Civil War, watched friends die in meaningless skirmishes, and learned that the noble causes men died for often dissolved into politics and profit once the smoke cleared. After the war, he drifted west, seeking not fortune, but simply distance from the death and disillusionment that haunted his memories. The ranch represented his attempt to build something clean and honest in a world that seemed increasingly dominated by corruption and violence. Rebel suddenly stopped, his ears flattening against his head. The stallion's entire body tensed, muscles quivering beneath his chestnut coat. Daniel had owned the horse for 3 years, had trained him from a wild Mustang caught in the northern ranges, and in all that time, Rebel had never shown fear. Ornery, yes. Stubborn, certainly. But never afraid. Easy boy, Daniel said, leaning forward to pat the horse's neck. But Rebel wouldn't move. Instead, the stallion turned his head sharply to the left, staring at a cluster of mesquite and creosote bushes about 50 yards from the trail. A low, rumbling sound came from deep in the horse's chest. Not quite a whinny, not quite a growl, but something primal that Daniel had never heard before. Daniel's hand moved instinctively to the rifle secured to his saddle. Apache raiders had been active in the region recently, attacking supply wagons and isolated homesteads. Just last month, the Henderson family had been found dead, their small ranch burned to the ground. The Territorial Army claimed they were responding to Apache aggression, but Daniel had heard whispers that the attacks were retaliation for something darker, a massacre of Apache women and children by a cavalry unit that had gone unpunished. But as Daniel scanned the landscape, he saw no signs of ambush, no movement among the rocks, no glint of weapons in the harsh sunlight, no dust clouds indicating approaching riders. Just the endless desert, the scraggly vegetation, and his increasingly agitated horse. What is it? Daniel asked, knowing the animal couldn't answer, but trusting the instincts that had kept Rebel alive in the wild before Daniel had captured him. The stallion pawed at the ground again, then took several steps toward the mesquite cluster without any command from Daniel. Against his better judgment, Daniel allowed the horse to lead. He kept his right hand on his rifle, his eyes scanning for threats, every sense heightened to the possibility of danger. As they approached the bushes, Daniel caught a smell that made his stomach turn, blood and something else, the sickly sweet scent of infection. Rebel stopped 10 feet from the largest mesquite bush, refusing to go closer, but also refusing to leave. Daniel dismounted carefully, drawing his rifle and approaching on foot. The desert floor was scattered with debris, broken arrows, torn fabric, and dark stains in the sand that could only be blood. Then he saw her. She was partially hidden beneath the mesquite, her body almost invisible against the desert colors. At first, Daniel thought she was dead, just another casualty of the endless cycle of violence that defined the frontier. But then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest, the barely perceptible movement that separated life from death. Daniel approached cautiously, his rifle ready but pointed down. As he got closer, details emerged that made the scene even more disturbing. She was Apache, that much was clear from her clothing and features, but she bore wounds that told a complicated story. 3 arrows protruded from her body, one through her left shoulder, one embedded in her side, and one that had grazed her thigh, leaving a deep gash. But these weren't cavalry arrows. They were Apache, marked with the distinctive fletching patterns Daniel had learned to recognize during his years on the frontier. Her own people had shot her. Daniel knelt beside her, setting his rifle within reach, but freeing his hands to check for signs of life. Her skin was hot to the touch, fever burning through her body. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Flies had already begun gathering around her wounds, and the smell of infection was overwhelming at close range. He gently touched her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak and irregular, but present. She was alive, though probably not for much longer without immediate help. "Can you hear me?" Daniel asked, though he didn't expect a response. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow and labored. Daniel sat back on his heels, his mind racing through his options. The smart choice, the safe choice, was to ride onto the trading post, report what he'd found to the territorial marshal, and let the authorities handle it. Getting involved with Apache affairs was dangerous on multiple levels. The territorial government required all settlers to report any Apache individuals to the army for relocation to reservations. Failing to do so was a federal crime that carried a minimum sentence of 2 years in prison. But beyond the legal dangers, there were practical concerns. If other Apache discovered he'd taken one of their people, even to help her, they might interpret it as kidnapping or hostage-taking. And if other settlers learned he'd aided an Apache, he'd be branded a traitor to his own kind, possibly targeted for retribution. Every rational calculation pointed toward leaving her and riding away. She was dying anyway. There was nothing he could do that would change that outcome. Involving himself would only bring danger to his doorstep. Daniel looked at the woman's face, peaceful despite the obvious pain her body was enduring. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Her hands, visible despite the dirt and blood, were calloused in ways that spoke of hard work, not warfare. These weren't the hands of a raider or warrior. These were the hands of someone who had spent her life working, creating, surviving. He thought about the Henderson family, massacred in their home. He thought about the Apache women and children killed by cavalry soldiers in what was euphemistically called defensive actions. He thought about all the death and suffering he'd witnessed during the war, all the times he'd followed orders that made no moral sense, all the moments when doing the right thing had been sacrificed for doing the expedient thing. "Damn it," Daniel muttered. Making his decision, he returned to Rebel, who was still watching the mesquite bush with obvious anxiety. "Easy, boy. We're taking her with us." The stallion's ears flicked back, but the horse didn't resist as Daniel retrieved his canteen and a blanket from his saddlebags. Working carefully, Daniel gave the woman small sips of water, just enough to wet her lips without choking her. Then he began the delicate work of examining her wounds. The arrow in her shoulder had missed major arteries, but was embedded deeply in muscle. The one in her side was more concerning, potentially having damaged internal organs. The thigh wound, while bloody, was probably the least dangerous. Daniel had field medical training from his war years, enough to know that moving her with the arrows still embedded was risky, but leaving them in place was even more dangerous. The infection spreading from the wounds would kill her within hours if left untreated. Using his knife, Daniel cut away the arrow shafts, leaving just enough protruding to grip later when he could properly extract them. The woman moaned softly during this process, her first sound since he'd found her, but she didn't regain consciousness. Getting her onto Rebel proved challenging. The stallion, normally steady under pressure, shied away from the smell of blood and infection. It took Daniel 15 minutes of patient coaxing before he could drape the unconscious woman across the saddle, securing her with rope to prevent her from falling. The trading post was 15 miles south. His ranch was 8 miles north. Going to the trading post meant immediate medical supplies, but also meant explaining to the marshal why he was transporting a wounded Apache woman. Going to his ranch meant isolation and limited supplies, but also time to make decisions without government interference. Daniel pointed Rebel north toward home. The journey took 3 hours, moving slowly to avoid jostling the woman too severely. The sun climbed higher, then began its descent toward the western horizon. Daniel walked beside the horse, one hand on the reins, the other steadying the woman's unconscious form. His mind kept circling back to the arrows, trying to understand what had happened to her. Apache tribes had complex social structures and justice systems. Execution by arrow was typically reserved for serious crimes, murder, betrayal of the tribe, or collaboration with enemies. But 3 arrows suggested something more personal, more emotional than formal execution. This felt like rage, like someone had wanted her to suffer. As his ranch came into view, a modest collection of buildings huddled against a canyon wall, Daniel felt the full weight of what he'd committed to. Once he brought her onto his property, once he began treating her wounds, there would be no innocent explanation if discovered. He would be breaking federal law, risking imprisonment, and potentially marking himself as an enemy to both Apache and settlers. But as he looked at the woman's pale, fever-stricken face, he found he didn't care about the consequences. Some choices transcended calculation. Some moments demanded action regardless of personal cost. This was one of those moments. Daniel carried her into his cabin and laid her on his bed, the only soft surface available. Then he began the meticulous work of saving her life, starting with the careful extraction of 3 Apache arrows that someone had wanted to be the last things she ever felt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daniel's hands trembled as he lit every oil lamp in his cabin, flooding the single room with as much light as possible. The woman lay motionless on his bed, her breathing so shallow he had to watch closely to confirm she was still alive. He'd removed countless bullets and shrapnel during the war, but arrow extraction was different. The barbed heads designed to tear flesh on removal, causing potentially fatal bleeding if done incorrectly. He pulled his father's old medical kit from beneath the floorboards, a battered leather case containing surgical tools his father had carried as a field surgeon during the Mexican War. Daniel had inherited both the kit and a rudimentary knowledge of battlefield medicine, though he'd never imagined using either to save an Apache woman in his own cabin. The first arrow, lodged in her shoulder, required careful work. Daniel used his sharpest knife to widen the entry wound slightly, then gripped the arrow shaft with leather-wrapped pliers. One smooth, firm pull, the barbed head came free with a sickening sound, followed by a fresh surge of blood. The woman's body convulsed, a guttural moan escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. Daniel packed the wound with strips of clean cloth soaked in whiskey, the only antiseptic he had. His father had taught him that alcohol burned away the invisible things that caused infection, a concept most frontier doctors dismissed as superstition, but one that had saved lives in Daniel's experience. The side wound proved more treacherous. The arrow had entered at an angle, and Daniel couldn't determine how deep it had penetrated. If it had punctured her stomach or intestines, she would likely die from internal bleeding or sepsis, no matter what he did. But leaving the arrow in guaranteed death, so extraction was the only option. He cut away more tissue, probing gently with his fingers to feel the arrow's path. The woman's breathing became more labored, her fever spiking as her body responded to the trauma. Daniel worked as quickly as precision allowed, finally getting a solid grip on the arrow. This time the extraction brought a terrifying amount of blood. He pressed cloth against the wound, applying pressure while simultaneously trying to see if organs had been damaged. After 5 agonizing minutes, the bleeding slowed to something manageable. Daniel couldn't be certain, but he believed the arrow had missed vital organs, traveling through muscle and fat tissue instead. He cleaned and packed the wound, then moved to the thigh injury. The leg wound was straightforward by comparison, a deep laceration but no embedded projectile. Daniel stitched it closed with practiced efficiency, using thread boiled in water to reduce infection risk. His father had believed in cleanliness with an almost religious fervor, insisting that clean tools and clean water saved more lives than any medicine. By the time Daniel finished treating all 3 wounds, dawn was breaking through the cabin's single window. He'd worked through the entire night. The woman's fever remained dangerously high, her skin burning beneath his touch. He needed to cool her body temperature before the heat itself killed her. Daniel carried her outside to the water trough, laying her in the shallow water, still dressed in what remained of her clothing. The shock of cold water produced an immediate reaction. Her eyes snapped open for the first time, unfocused and wild with confusion and pain. "Easy," Daniel said, holding her shoulders to prevent her from thrashing and reopening her wounds. "You're safe." "I'm trying to help." She stared at him without comprehension, her eyes seeing but not processing. Then she began speaking rapidly in Apache, words tumbling out in desperate urgency. Daniel couldn't understand the language, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear, pleading, warning. "I don't understand," Daniel said helplessly. "But you're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." Whether she understood his tone or simply exhausted herself, the woman went limp in his arms. Her eyes closed again, consciousness slipping away. Daniel kept her in the water for another 10 minutes before carrying her back inside and wrapping her in dry blankets. Over the following days, Daniel fell into exhausting routine, changing bandages, forcing water and thin broth between her lips, monitoring her fever, and watching constantly for signs of infection. The wounds remained clean, his whiskey treatment apparently successful, but the fever persisted with stubborn intensity. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. Daniel woke from a fitful sleep in his chair to find her eyes open and lucid. Watching him with wary intelligence, "Water," she whispered in accented but clear English. Daniel nearly dropped the cup in his surprise. "You speak English?" She drank deeply before responding. "Mission school. 10 years. Her voice was rough from disuse and dehydration. "Where am I?" "My ranch. About 40 miles north of Fort Benson. I found you in the desert 3 days ago. You were dying." Her hand moved to her shoulder, feeling the bandages. "The arrows, I removed them. You're lucky. Another few hours and infection would have killed you." She studied him with unsettling intensity, as if trying to reconcile his actions with her expectations of how a white settler should behave. "Why did you help me?" Daniel had been asking himself the same question. "Because you needed help." That is not a reason white men usually give. "Maybe I'm not like most white men." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, though it contained no warmth. "We will see." She closed her eyes, exhaustion reclaiming her. As days passed, the woman slowly regained strength. Her wounds healed cleanly, the stitches holding, the torn tissue gradually knitting itself back together. But she remained largely silent, speaking only when necessary. Watching Daniel with that same calculating wariness. On the 7th day, while Daniel was changing her bandages, she finally spoke beyond basic necessities. "My name is Sarah Whitehorse." Daniel paused, surprised by the Christian first name paired with a traditional Apache surname. "Daniel Crawford. You are wondering about my name." It wasn't a question, but Daniel nodded. "The mission school gave it to me. They said Sarah was a woman who survived impossible things. They were not wrong. What happened to you?" Daniel asked carefully. "Those were Apache arrows." Sarah's jaw tightened. "My husband. He believed I betrayed him with a Mexican trader. I did not, but his brother wanted my father's horses and convinced him it was true. Apache law allows a husband to kill an unfaithful wife. The casual brutality of the statement hung in the air. So they shot you and left you to die. My husband's aim was not as certain as his conviction. Bitterness dripped from every word. The arrows were meant to kill quickly. Instead, they left me alive long enough to understand that my own family watched and did nothing." Daniel understood now why she'd been half buried in the desert. She'd been crawling, trying to find shelter or water, eventually collapsing in the mesquite where Rebel had found her. "Where will you go when you're healed?" Daniel asked. Sarah's laugh was harsh. "Go, I'm dead to my people. If I return, my husband will finish what he started. If I go to the reservation, the agent will give me back to my tribe. If I go to the fort, the soldiers will use me, then discard me. You could stay here." The words surprised Daniel as much as they did Sarah. He hadn't planned to say it, hadn't consciously made the decision, but once spoken, he realized it was the only acceptable outcome. Sarah stared at him. "You would let an Apache woman live in your home. The authorities would imprison you. Only if they find out, your neighbors would kill us both." "I don't have neighbors. Closest ranch is 20 miles south." Sarah studied him with that penetrating gaze. "Why would you risk this?" Daniel set down the bandages and met her eyes. "During the war, I did terrible things because I was ordered to. I watched good men die for causes that meant nothing. When the war ended, I came out here to build something clean, something that wasn't corrupted by politics or greed or hate. If I let you die or turn you over to people who will harm you, then I'm just continuing the same cycle of cruelty I thought I'd escaped." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Sarah spoke. "You are either a very good man or a very foolish one. Probably both." This time, her smile contained genuine warmth. "Then I will stay, Daniel Crawford. But you should know something." Her expression turned serious. "I was not just a wife. Before the mission school, before my marriage, I was trained as a healer. My grandmother was the most respected medicine woman in our band. She taught me plants, remedies, treatments that white doctors do not know. If I stay, I can teach you. Your medicine saved my body. Mine can save others." Daniel felt something shift in that moment, a recognition that this arrangement could be more than simple charity. It could be an exchange of knowledge, a genuine partnership. "I'd like that," he said. Over the following weeks, Sarah's strength returned fully. She began moving around the cabin, then the ranch grounds, orienting herself to this new life. She showed Daniel desert plants he'd walked past for years without recognizing their medicinal value. She taught him how to prepare poultices that reduced inflammation more effectively than anything in his father's medical kit. She shared knowledge of wound treatment that surpassed what he'd learned in the army. But more than medical knowledge, Sarah brought perspective Daniel had never considered. She explained Apache views of land ownership, justice, and community responsibility that challenged his assumptions about civilization and savagery. She described the mission school system that had tried to erase her culture while teaching her English and mathematics. A strange combination of education and cultural destruction. Daniel, in turn, taught her about ranch management, showed her how to handle firearms with precision, and shared his own journey from idealistic soldier to disillusioned survivor to isolated rancher seeking peace. 3 months after Rebel had led him to the dying woman in the desert, Daniel looked up from repairing a fence to see Sarah approaching with a basket of herbs she'd been gathering. "The purple flowers you asked about," she said, "for infection. They grow near the spring." "Thank you." Daniel accepted the basket. "Sarah, I've been thinking. You can't stay hidden forever. Eventually, someone will visit, or I'll need to go to town for supplies, and questions will arise." Sarah nodded, having clearly considered the same problem. "What do you propose?" "We tell people you're my wife, that I married a woman from back east who came west to join me. Your English is perfect enough that most people won't question it if we're careful, and if they discover the truth, then we deal with it together." Sarah considered this, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled. "Very well, husband. But you should know I do not cook well, and I refuse to pretend otherwise." Daniel laughed. "I noticed. Your medicinal skills are impressive, but your stew tastes like boot leather. That is because I used boot leather. I thought it was dried meat." They both laughed, the tension of their strange situation momentarily lifting. What had begun as a simple act of compassion was evolving into something neither had anticipated, a genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and shared isolation from the worlds that had rejected them. Both, but as Daniel would learn in the years to come, saving Sarah Whitehorse's life had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately force him to confront not just local prejudices, but a conspiracy of corruption that reached far beyond his isolated ranch into the heart of territorial power itself. 2 years had passed since Daniel found Sarah dying in the desert, and the arrangement they'd created had evolved into something neither could have predicted. The ranch flourished under their combined knowledge. Daniel's practical ranching skills merged with Sarah's deep understanding of the land, water sources, and seasonal patterns that white settlers often ignored. Sarah had transformed the area near the spring into a thriving medicinal garden, cultivating plants she'd gathered from across the territory. She dried herbs in the cabin rafters, prepared remedies in clay pots, and kept meticulous notes in a journal Daniel had purchased during one of his rare trips to town. Her healing knowledge had already proven invaluable. When Daniel suffered a rattlesnake bite that would have killed him without her immediate intervention with a poultice that drew out the venom, their cover story as husband and wife had been tested only twice. A traveling merchant had stopped at the ranch seeking water, accepting without question Daniel's explanation that his wife was Eastern-born but preferred frontier life. A cavalry patrol had passed through once, but Sarah had hidden in the canyon until they departed, Daniel explaining his wife was visiting relatives in Tucson. But isolation had its costs. Daniel rarely went to town anymore, fearful that extended absence might lead someone to visit the ranch and discover Sarah. They lived in a bubble of safety that required constant vigilance to maintain. On a crisp autumn morning in 1870, that bubble began to crack. Daniel was mending the corral fence when Rebel suddenly lifted his head, ears pointed east toward the main trail. The stallion's body language was alert, but not alarmed. He recognized whoever was approaching. "Sarah," Daniel called toward the cabin. "Someone's coming." She emerged quickly, already assessing escape routes. They'd planned for this scenario countless times. If visitors arrived unexpectedly, Sarah would retreat to a hidden cave in the canyon, taking supplies to last several days if necessary. But as the rider crested the ridge, Daniel recognized him and felt his stomach tighten. Thomas Garrett, the U.S. Marshal for the Southern Territory, rode toward the ranch with the easy confidence of a man who expected cooperation. "Stay inside, but stay visible," Daniel said quietly to Sarah. "Garrett's seen plenty of frontier wives. Act natural." Sarah nodded and returned to the cabin, positioning herself near the window where she could be seen working on meal preparation, a convincingly domestic scene. Garrett dismounted near the corral, his marshal's badge catching sunlight. He was a lean man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Unlike many territorial officials, Garrett had a reputation for fairness, enforcing law without the corruption that plagued other jurisdictions. "Crawford," Garrett said, extending his hand. "Been meaning to visit for months. You're a hard man to find out here. Marshal." Daniel shook his hand, keeping his expression neutral. "What brings you this far north?" "Apache troubles, mostly. There's been increased raiding activity along the territorial border. I'm visiting all the isolated ranches, making sure folks are safe and gathering information." Daniel's mind raced. "Haven't seen any raiders. Been quiet out here." Garrett's eyes drifted toward the cabin, where Sarah's silhouette was visible through the window. "I heard you'd married. Congratulations." "Thank you. Sarah's from Pennsylvania originally. Came west 2 years ago." "Pennsylvania," Garrett repeated, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Long journey for a woman alone. She came with a wagon train. We met when they stopped at Fort Benson for supplies." Garrett nodded slowly, and Daniel couldn't tell if the marshal believed the story or was simply being polite. "Mind if I water my horse?" "It's been a long ride." "Of course." As Garrett led his horse to the trough, he continued talking. "There's something else I need to discuss. There's been reports of a missing Apache woman from the reservation. She disappeared about 2 years ago, under suspicious circumstances. Her husband claimed she died, but no body was ever found." Daniel's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. "What does that have to do with me?" "Probably nothing," Garrett said, watching Daniel's face carefully. "But the woman spoke English fluently, mission-educated. Some folks speculated she might have tried to pass as white and disappear into settler society." The implication hung in the air like a blade. Garrett was too intelligent not to have done the mathematics. A missing Apache woman 2 years ago, Daniel suddenly acquiring a wife around the same time. The convenient story of a Pennsylvania bride. "That's an interesting theory," Daniel said carefully. "But I imagine a lone Apache woman would have a hard time surviving on her own, much less integrating into white society. You'd be surprised what people can do when they're desperate." Garrett finished watering his horse and turned to face Daniel squarely. "Crawford, I'm going to be direct with you. I don't care much about the territorial regulations regarding Apache individuals. I think most of those laws are unjust and designed to persecute people who just want to live in peace." Daniel's surprise must have shown on his face, because Garrett smiled grimly. "I know that's not a popular opinion among my fellow lawmen, but I've seen too much cruelty disguised as policy. I've watched families destroyed by regulations that serve land speculators more than public safety. Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know that if a man happened to have helped someone in desperate need, someone who posed no threat to anyone, I wouldn't consider that a crime worth prosecuting. I'd consider that human decency." The statement was as close to an explicit acknowledgement as Garrett could make, without directly implicating himself in overlooking federal law. Daniel studied the marshal's face, trying to determine if this was genuine compassion or an elaborate trap. "Hypothetically speaking," Daniel said slowly, "if such a situation existed, what would you advise?" "Hypothetically, I'd advise extreme caution. Not all marshals share my views. There's a new territorial governor taking office next month, Preston Montgomery. He's a political appointee with ambitions for higher office, and he's made his reputation by being tough on Apache issues. He'll be looking for examples to make, ways to demonstrate his commitment to settler security." Garrett mounted his horse, preparing to leave. "I'd also advise that if someone was living under an assumed identity, they should become very good at maintaining that identity. Documentation helps. Marriage certificates, property records, anything that establishes a legal presence." "That's good advice," Daniel said. Hypothetically, Garrett smiled. "One more thing. There's a lawyer in Tucson named Benjamin Ross. He's sympathetic to people in difficult situations and discreet about his client relationships. If someone ever needed legal documentation or advice on complicated matters, Ross would be the man to see." With that, Garrett rode away, leaving Daniel standing in his corral, mind racing with implications. The marshal's visit had been both a warning and an offer of help, but it also meant their secret was compromised, at least partially. Garrett might be sympathetic, but he was just one man in a law enforcement system filled with others who wouldn't share his perspective. Daniel found Sarah standing just inside the cabin door. Having heard everything through the open window, he knows, she said simply. He suspects. But he's giving us a chance to prepare. For what? For whatever's coming. This new Governor Garrett mentioned, if he's looking to make examples, we need to be ready. Over the following weeks, Daniel made the dangerous journey to Tucson, locating Benjamin Ross in a small office above a general store. The lawyer was a slight man in his 40s, with intelligent eyes and a manner that suggested he'd heard many unusual stories without judgment. Daniel explained the situation carefully, leaving out specific details that could incriminate Sarah directly. Ross listened without interruption, then nodded thoughtfully. What you need is documentation, establishing your wife's legal existence independent of her actual origins. A marriage certificate would be a start, but we should go further. Property records showing she inherited land back east that she sold before coming west. Letters of introduction from fictional relatives. The more documentation we create, the more difficult it becomes for anyone to challenge her identity. Is that legal? Ross smiled grimly. The law is complicated when it comes to Apache individuals and citizenship. Technically, Apache people aren't considered U.S. citizens, which creates a legal gray area regarding documentation. I prefer to think of what we're doing as correcting an injustice rather than committing fraud. Over the next month, Ross created a comprehensive fictional history for Sarah Crawford, née Sarah Mitchell of Philadelphia. Birth records, marriage certificate, property inheritance documents, even correspondence from relatives, all carefully aged and notarized. The documentation was expensive, costing Daniel most of his savings, but it was armor against scrutiny. When Daniel returned to the ranch with the documents, Sarah examined them with mixture of wonder and sadness. "This makes me real," she said quietly. "But it also erases who I actually am. Sarah Whitehorse no longer exists. She died in the desert 2 years ago. Would you rather risk exposure?" "No, but I can mourn what's being lost even while accepting its necessity." Daniel understood. They were creating safety through erasure, protection through denial of identity. It was a bargain countless people had made throughout history, survival in exchange for authenticity. The winter of 1870 passed quietly. Spring brought the first real test of their prepared documentation when a land surveyor arrived to verify property boundaries for territorial tax purposes. Sarah presented herself as Mrs. Crawford with calm confidence, showing the surveyor their marriage certificate when he asked about household size for tax assessment. He accepted it without question, noting in his records that Daniel Crawford and wife Sarah occupied the property. But as summer approached, tensions across the territory escalated. Apache raiding increased, prompted by broken treaty promises and continued encroachment on reservation lands. The territorial government responded with harsh crackdowns, increased cavalry presence, and new regulations requiring all Apache individuals to carry identification papers at all times. Governor Montgomery made good on his reputation, publicly calling for the complete removal of Apache populations to distant reservations in Oklahoma. He painted any settler who sympathized with Apache concerns as traitors to civilization, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Daniel and Sarah watched these developments with growing anxiety. The careful balance they'd maintained was becoming increasingly precarious. One misstep, one suspicious neighbor, one overzealous official, and their constructed identity could collapse. Then, in August of 1871, everything changed. Daniel returned from checking his northern fence line to find Sarah in the garden, her face troubled. "Riders came while you were gone," she said. "3 men. They claimed to be conducting a census for the territorial government. They asked questions: how long we'd been married, where I was from, whether I'd seen any Apache individuals in the area. What did you tell them? The story we prepared. But Daniel, one of them was Apache, a tracker working for the army. He watched me the entire time with this look, like he was trying to place my face, like he almost recognized me. This was the nightmare scenario they'd always feared. Sarah's own people, pressed into service for the territorial government, might recognize her despite the years and her adopted identity. Did he say anything? No, but when they left, he kept looking back. I think he's going to report his suspicions. Daniel felt the careful world they'd built beginning to crack. They had documentation, they had a cover story, but against someone who actually remembered Sarah from her life before. Those protections might prove worthless. We need to prepare for the possibility that we'll have to leave, Daniel said. Start gathering supplies, documents, money, anything we can't replace. But even as he spoke, Daniel knew that running would solve nothing. They couldn't spend their lives fleeing from territory to territory, always looking over their shoulders. At some point, they would have to stand and fight for the life they'd built. That point, as it turned out, was coming far sooner than either of them expected. 2 days later, a contingent of cavalry soldiers arrived at the ranch, led by a captain whose orders were clear: investigate Daniel Crawford and his alleged wife for possible violation of federal Apache regulations. The battle for their survival was about to begin. Captain William Hayes dismounted with military precision, his polished boots hitting the ground as 6 cavalry soldiers fanned out behind him. The captain was young, perhaps 30, with the rigid bearing of someone determined to prove himself worthy of his rank. His eyes swept across the ranch with the methodical assessment of a man conducting an inspection rather than a visit. Daniel stood on his porch, rifle within reach but not in hand, a careful balance between preparedness and non-aggression. Sarah remained inside the cabin, visible through the window but not emerging, playing the role of the cautious frontier wife, wary of unexpected military visitors. "Daniel Crawford?" Hayes asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "That's right. What can I do for the army, Captain?" Hayes pulled a folded document from his jacket. "I'm here on orders from Governor Montgomery's office. There have been reports that you may be harboring an Apache fugitive in violation of federal law. Reports from whom?" "That's not your concern. I'm authorized to conduct a thorough inspection of your property and interview all residents." Hayes gestured toward the cabin. "That would include your wife." Daniel's mind raced through their options. Refusing inspection would confirm suspicions and likely result in forced compliance. Allowing inspection meant exposing Sarah to scrutiny by soldiers who might include the Apache tracker she'd mentioned. "My wife is inside. She's welcome to answer your questions, but I'd appreciate if you'd conduct yourself respectfully. She's not accustomed to being interrogated by armed soldiers." Something flickered in Hayes's expression, perhaps annoyance at the implied criticism, perhaps acknowledgement that frontier women deserved consideration. "I have no intention of being disrespectful, but I will be thorough." Hayes climbed the porch steps, leaving his soldiers positioned around the property. Daniel followed, his presence a silent statement that Sarah wouldn't face questioning alone. Inside the cabin, Sarah stood near the table, her posture straight but not defensive. She'd changed into a simple cotton dress that could have belonged to any settler woman, her hair pulled back in a style common among frontier wives. Nothing about her appearance immediately suggested Apache heritage. But Daniel knew that closer inspection might reveal details: the shape of her features, certain mannerisms, the way she held herself. "Mrs. Crawford," Hayes began, his tone formal, "I need to ask you some questions regarding your background and residence here." "Of course." "Captain." Sarah's English carried no trace of accent, her diction perfect from years at the mission school. "Where are you from originally?" "Philadelphia. My father was a merchant there until he passed in 1867. "And how did you come to be in Arizona Territory?" Sarah reached for the documentation Benjamin Ross had prepared, handling it with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to proving their identity. After my father's death, I had little keeping me in Philadelphia. I sold his business and joined a wagon train heading west. I met Daniel when the train stopped at Fort Benson. Hayes examined the documents: marriage certificate, property sale records from Philadelphia, letters of introduction. Daniel watched the captain's face, trying to gauge whether he found the paperwork convincing or suspicious. "These documents appear in order," Hayes said slowly, "but I'm obligated to inform you that there are questions about your identity. Specifically, whether you might actually be an Apache woman named Sarah Whitehorse, who disappeared from the reservation approximately 2 years ago." Sarah's expression remained calm, though Daniel saw her hands tighten slightly on the table's edge. "I'm sorry, Captain, but that's absurd. I'm from Philadelphia, as the documents clearly show. Documents can be forged. They can. But these aren't. You're welcome to send inquiries to Philadelphia if you doubt their authenticity." Hayes studied her face with uncomfortable intensity. "There's an Apache tracker with my unit who believes he recognizes you from his tribe. Then he's mistaken. I've never lived on a reservation, and I've certainly never been Apache." Sarah's voice carried just the right amount of indignation, not defensive, but reasonably offended by the accusation. The standoff might have continued indefinitely had not one of the soldiers outside called for the captain. Hayes excused himself and stepped onto the porch. Through the window, Daniel watched him confer with a young sergeant who gestured urgently toward the canyon. When Hayes returned, his expression was troubled. "My men have found what appears to be a medicinal garden near your spring. Plants that are distinctly used in Apache healing practices. Care to explain that, Mrs. Crawford?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'm a botanist, Captain. Or rather, I studied botany extensively in Philadelphia. When I arrived here, I began cataloging native plants and their properties. Many Apache medicinal plants have genuine pharmaceutical value. Documenting them is scientific work, not cultural identification." It was a brilliant pivot, recasting her knowledge as academic interest rather than cultural heritage. Hayes seemed momentarily thrown by the explanation. "You're claiming to be a scientist?" "I'm claiming to have scientific education and curiosity." "Is that so difficult to believe of a woman?" The question hung in the air, challenging Hayes to reveal whether his skepticism stemmed from evidence or prejudice. Daniel watched the captain struggle with the implications. Before Hayes could respond, another commotion erupted outside. Daniel heard raised voices, then a sound that made his blood run cold, the Apache tracker speaking rapidly in his native language, his tone urgent and accusatory. Hayes strode outside again, and this time Daniel followed. The tracker, a lean man perhaps 40 years old with weathered features and intense eyes, stood near the medicinal garden, gesturing emphatically. "What's he saying?" Hayes demanded of a soldier who apparently spoke some Apache. The soldier translated haltingly. "He says the garden arrangement follows traditional Apache patterns, that the plants are grouped by purpose the way healers from his grandmother's generation taught. He says no white botanist would know these arrangements." The tracker's eyes locked onto Sarah, who had appeared in the cabin doorway. He spoke directly to her in Apache, a long string of words Daniel couldn't understand, but whose emotional weight was unmistakable. Recognition, confusion, and something that might have been grief. Sarah responded in English, her voice steady. "I don't understand what you're saying." "I don't speak Apache." But the tracker persisted, switching to heavily accented English. "You are Whitehorse's daughter. I know your face. I was at your wedding ceremony. You married Thomas Whitehorse, my cousin's son." The accusation hung in the desert air, like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Daniel felt the carefully constructed identity they'd built beginning to crumble. Documentation could be dismissed as forgery, but direct recognition from someone who had known Sarah in her previous life was far more damaging. Hayes turned to Sarah, his expression hardening. "Well, Mrs. Crawford, how do you respond to someone who claims to have attended your wedding, to a different man, in a different life?" Sarah descended the porch steps slowly, walking toward the tracker with deliberate calm. When she stood before him, she spoke in clear, measured English. "I understand that you believe you recognize me. Memory can be deceptive, especially when combined with desire to find someone lost. But I am not the woman you're looking for. I'm Sarah Crawford, born Sarah Mitchell in Philadelphia. I've never been Apache, never lived on a reservation, never married anyone except Daniel Crawford." The tracker shook his head violently. "Now you speak truth words with white woman voice, but your eyes are white horse eyes. Your grandmother was called Mountain Shadow. She taught you healing ways. You cannot hide this, Captain Hayes," Daniel interjected, his voice carefully controlled. "This tracker is clearly mistaken. He's seeing what he wants to see, finding patterns that confirm his assumptions. My wife has provided legal documentation of her identity. One man's insistence that he recognizes her doesn't override official records." Hayes looked between Sarah, the tracker, and the documents in his hand. Daniel could see the captain weighing political calculations, the new governor's orders to crack down on Apache violations versus the legal complications of arresting a woman with seemingly legitimate documentation based solely on one tracker's recognition. "There's a simple way to resolve this," Hayes said finally. "Mrs. Crawford, would you consent to being examined by a physician in Tucson? Someone who could assess whether you show signs of Apache heritage versus Eastern European ancestry." It was a trap disguised as reasonableness. Any such examination would likely reveal physical characteristics common among Apache peoples. "Regardless of how convincing Sarah's documentation appeared, I'll consent to no such thing," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "I've provided legal proof of my identity. I've answered your questions. I will not submit to some pseudoscientific examination designed to find evidence of a crime that doesn't exist." "Then you're refusing to cooperate with a federal investigation." "I'm refusing to be subjected to degrading treatment without cause." "There's a difference." The tension escalated as Hayes considered his options. Daniel's hand moved subtly toward the rifle, leaning against the porch post. He had no intention of starting violence, but he wouldn't allow Sarah to be forcibly removed without resistance. Then a voice cut through the standoff, calm and authoritative. "Captain Hayes, that won't be necessary." Everyone turned to see Marshal Thomas Garrett riding into the ranch yard, his presence immediately shifting the dynamics. Behind him rode another man Daniel didn't recognize, well-dressed in Eastern clothing, carrying a leather satchel that marked him as someone of professional standing. Hayes straightened. "Marshal Garrett, this is a military matter under territorial authority. Actually, Captain, it's a matter of civil law, which falls under my jurisdiction." Garrett dismounted, his manner friendly but firm. "I've been reviewing the Crawford case, and I've brought someone who can provide clarity. This is Judge Harold Blackston from the Territorial Appeals Court." The judge was an elderly man with white hair and sharp eyes that suggested a mind still keen despite his years. He examined the scene with judicial detachment before speaking. "Captain Hayes, I've reviewed the documentation submitted by Mr. and Mrs. Crawford. I've also received correspondence from legal contacts in Philadelphia, confirming the existence of Sarah Mitchell and her father's merchant business. The documents appear authentic and properly executed, but, Your Honor," Hayes protested, "we have an eyewitness who claims to recognize Mrs. Crawford as an Apache woman. Recognition based on memory is notoriously unreliable," Blackstone replied. "Courts require more substantial evidence than one man's claim, especially when contradicted by comprehensive documentation. Unless you have definitive proof that these documents are fraudulent, you have no legal basis for arrest or detention." The tracker spoke again in Apache, his voice desperate now. Sarah responded, and Daniel's heart nearly stopped as Apache words flowed from her mouth for the first time since he'd known her. But the words were brief, and when she switched back to English, her voice carried finality. "I told him I'm sorry for his loss, whatever it is, but I cannot be who he needs me to be. The statement was masterful, acknowledging the tracker's pain without confirming his accusation, offering compassion while maintaining her claimed identity. Hayes looked frustrated but outmaneuvered. A federal judge's intervention, combined with Marshal Garrett's obvious support for the Crawfords, left him with limited options. Arresting Sarah now would create a legal battle he might well lose, embarrassing both himself and Governor Montgomery. "This matter isn't closed," Hayes said finally. "I'll be filing a full report with the governor's office." "As is your right," Judge Blackstone acknowledged. "But until such time as you can produce evidence of actual wrongdoing, Mr. and Mrs. Crawford are free citizens, entitled to live on their property without harassment." The captain remounted with visible anger, his soldiers following suit. The Apache tracker lingered longest, staring at Sarah with an expression of profound sadness. Then he too mounted and rode away, leaving the ranch in tense silence. After the soldiers disappeared beyond the ridge, Garrett finally spoke. "That was closer than I'd like. How did you know to come?" Daniel asked. "The tracker visited me 3 days ago with his suspicions. I knew Hayes would eventually act on them, so I contacted Judge Blackstone, who owes me several favors from cases we've worked together. We've been following Hayes at a distance, waiting to see if our intervention would be necessary." Judge Blackstone studied Sarah with keen interest. "Young woman, I don't need to know your actual history, and I won't ask. But I will say this. The documentation you possess is legally sound. As long as you maintain that identity consistently, the law will protect you. However, Governor Montgomery is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. This incident will likely make you a target for continued scrutiny. What do you suggest?" Daniel asked. "Build community connections," Blackstone advised. "Become visible, established members of society. Join church groups if there are any nearby. Conduct business openly in town. The more people who know you as Sarah Crawford, the harder it becomes for anyone to claim you're someone else. And if the tracker persists in his claims, one man's unsupported testimony against documented identity and established community presence, no territorial court would prosecute. But you need to create that community presence quickly." After Garrett and Blackstone departed, Daniel and Sarah stood alone in their ranch yard, the enormity of what had just happened settling over them. "We can't keep living like this," Sarah said quietly. "Always hiding, always one recognition away from disaster. The tracker won't be the last person who knew me before. Eventually, someone will push harder than Hayes did, someone who won't be deterred by a sympathetic marshal and a friendly judge." "What are you suggesting?" Sarah's expression was thoughtful. Judge Blackstone was right about one thing. We need to become so established that challenging our identity becomes more costly than accepting it. But that means engaging with the very society that would destroy us if they knew the truth. Are you willing to do that? I don't see another choice. We either hide forever or we build something so strong that the truth becomes irrelevant because our present reality is more powerful than our past. Daniel understood what she was proposing, not just maintaining a false identity, but embedding themselves so deeply in settler society that questioning their legitimacy would seem absurd. It was audacious and risky, but perhaps the only path forward. Neither of them knew that their plan to become established community members would soon reveal a conspiracy far larger than their personal survival, a network of corruption that would force them to choose between continued hiding and fighting for justice that extended far beyond their isolated ranch. The confrontation with Captain Hayes was just the beginning. The real battle was still to come. The following months brought unexpected transformation. Daniel and Sarah began venturing into the small settlement of Copper Springs, 23 miles southwest of their ranch. What had started as necessary supply runs evolved into deliberate community building. Sarah joined the informal women's group that met weekly to share recipes and news. Daniel attended town meetings discussing water rights and grazing boundaries. They became familiar faces rather than mysterious hermits. The strategy worked better than anticipated. Within 6 months, Sarah Crawford was known throughout Copper Springs as the educated Eastern woman who helped treat illnesses with her botanical knowledge. When the schoolteacher's daughter developed a dangerous fever, Sarah's remedies succeeded where the town doctor's conventional treatments had failed. When old Mrs. Henderson suffered from arthritis that left her bedridden, Sarah prepared poultices that restored her mobility. Gratitude built trust, and trust built protection, but integration into settler society exposed them to things they'd been sheltered from in isolation. During a town meeting in March of 1872, Daniel heard something that made the hairs on his neck stand up. Marcus Pemberton, a wealthy cattleman who owned vast holdings south of Copper Springs, was presenting a proposal to the town council. He wanted to construct a toll road through public land, claiming it would improve commerce and connectivity. The council seemed inclined to approve, swayed by Pemberton's promises of economic growth and his barely veiled threats about withdrawing business from merchants who opposed him. Daniel wouldn't have paid much attention, except for one detail. The proposed road would cut directly through Apache reservation, land that had been guaranteed by federal treaty just 5 years earlier. That land was promised to the Mescalero Apache in perpetuity. Daniel objected during the public comment period. "You can't just build through it because it's convenient." Pemberton turned cold eyes on Daniel. "Mr. Crawford, the Apache had their chance at that land and squandered it through violence and resistance to civilization. The territorial government has already approved reclassification of that section. The road is happening whether you approve or not." Reclassification. On what legal basis? On the basis that Governor Montgomery determined the land was being underutilized and represented a barrier to territorial development. Pemberton's smile was condescending. "I'm sure this troubles you given your sympathies, but progress cannot be halted by outdated treaties with hostile populations." The comment about Daniel's sympathies carried weight. His defense of Apache treaty rights had been noted, filed away as evidence of questionable loyalties. In Governor Montgomery's Arizona, defending native rights marked someone as suspect. That night, Daniel shared the exchange with Sarah, who listened with growing concern. "Reclassification is a legal maneuver," she said, her mission school education providing context. "Treaties can be modified or voided if the government claims changed circumstances, but it requires specific procedures, congressional approval, formal documentation. Montgomery can't just declare treaty land void on his own authority, unless no one challenges him." Exactly. And who would challenge him? The Apache tribes lacked legal standing to sue in territorial courts. The federal government rarely intervenes in treaty disputes unless forced. Pemberton and Montgomery can do whatever they want, as long as no one with legal standing objects. Daniel studied his wife's face, seeing the wheels turning behind her eyes. "You're thinking about something." "I'm thinking that if someone with legal standing filed a challenge, the land grab could be stopped. Someone like a concerned citizen who owns property adjacent to the disputed territory and has legitimate interest in ensuring proper legal procedures are followed." "We own property adjacent to that section," Daniel said slowly, understanding where she was heading. "We do. And as property owners with potential interest in future land use patterns, we would have standing to challenge the reclassification in territorial court." "Sarah, that would put us directly in Montgomery's crosshairs. We've spent 2 years trying to avoid official attention, and we'll spend the rest of our lives running from shadows unless we build something stronger than fear." Her voice carried quiet intensity. "Daniel, my people are losing their land through legal tricks they can't fight. I can fight them. I have the education, the understanding of law, the legal identity to bring challenges. If I don't use those advantages to help, what was the point of surviving?" Daniel saw the truth in her words, but also the enormous risk. Challenging Pemberton and Montgomery meant exposing themselves to intense scrutiny. Every detail of their lives would be examined, every document questioned, every claim investigated. "If we do this," Daniel said. "There's no going back. They'll come after us with everything they have. Then we'd better make sure our foundation is unshakable." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into research with the same intensity she'd once applied to medicinal plants. She corresponded with Benjamin Ross, the Tucson lawyer who'd created their documentation, seeking guidance on filing legal challenges. She studied territorial law, federal treaty obligations, and precedents for citizen challenges to government land actions. What she discovered was even worse than they'd suspected. The proposed road through reservation land was just one piece of a much larger pattern. Governor Montgomery and his associates, including Pemberton, had been systematically reclassifying Apache lands throughout the territory. Sections guaranteed by treaty were being redesignated as surplus or underutilized, and then sold to Montgomery's political allies at a fraction of their value. Those allies would then develop or resell the land at enormous profit, sharing portions with Montgomery through carefully disguised financial arrangements. It was legal theft on a massive scale, hidden behind bureaucratic language and facilitated by a territorial government that answered to political appointees rather than citizens or treaty obligations. "Look at this," Sarah said one evening, spreading maps across their table. She'd marked every parcel of former Apache land that had been reclassified in the past 2 years. The pattern was unmistakable. A systematic dismantling of reservation boundaries that would eventually leave Apache peoples with nothing. "How much land are we talking about?" Daniel asked. "Over 200,000 acres. Enough to displace every Apache family still trying to maintain traditional ways of life. Within 5 years, if this continues, there won't be any Apache land left except the most barren, worthless sections no settler wants." Daniel studied the maps, seeing not just stolen land, but destroyed communities, families forced onto smaller and smaller parcels until survival became impossible. It was genocide disguised as land management policy. "We have to stop this." "We can try," Sarah corrected. But Daniel, challenging this won't just anger Montgomery and Pemberton. It will expose the entire corruption network. There are probably dozens of wealthy men profiting from these land grabs. They won't give up those profits without a fight. Do we have enough evidence to prove the corruption? Sarah pulled out another stack of documents she'd painstakingly compiled from public records. "I have documentation showing that Pemberton purchased 23,000 acres of former Apache land for 12 cents per acre. That same land is currently valued at $15 per acre after he developed it with territorial government contracts. The math tells the story. He paid $2,260 for land now worth $345,000, and Montgomery approved the sale, approved the reclassification, approved the sale, and according to these financial records I obtained through Ross's contacts, Montgomery's brother-in-law is Pemberton's business partner in 3 separate development companies. It was the kind of corruption that would be scandalous if exposed. But exposure required someone willing to file legal challenges and endure the inevitable counterattack. "How do we proceed?" Daniel asked. "We file a formal legal objection to the toll road, citing improper reclassification procedures. That forces a hearing where evidence must be presented. During that hearing, we introduce the larger pattern of questionable land transfers. We make the corruption visible to federal authorities who might actually care about treaty violations. And if the territorial courts side with Montgomery, then we appeal to federal courts. Treaty violations are federal matters. If we can get the case elevated beyond Montgomery's jurisdiction, we might actually win." It was a long shot, built on optimistic assumptions about justice prevailing over political power. But it was also the only real option, besides continued hiding or accepting that Apache lands would be stolen without anyone objecting. Daniel made the decision. "File the objection. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Sarah's legal objection, filed in April of 1872, landed like a bombshell in territorial politics. No one had challenged Montgomery's land policies before, partly from fear and partly because few people had the legal knowledge to mount effective challenges. Sarah's objection was meticulous, citing specific treaty provisions, procedural requirements, and federal statutes that Montgomery's reclassification had violated. The territorial court was forced to schedule a hearing, much to the obvious displeasure of Judge Nathan Cross, a Montgomery appointee known for rubber-stamping government actions. But even Cross couldn't simply dismiss a properly filed legal challenge without at least the appearance of due process. The hearing was scheduled for June 15th in Tucson. Sarah would have to present arguments before a hostile judge, opposed by territorial attorneys with far more resources and experience. But she had something they didn't expect: genuine legal knowledge combined with moral conviction. As word of the hearing spread, reactions divided sharply. Apache communities began viewing Sarah Crawford with cautious hope, this mysterious white woman who spoke their cause using white man's law. Settler communities viewed her with suspicion or outright hostility, seeing her as either a naive idealist or something more sinister. Pemberton's response was more direct. 2 weeks before the hearing, 3 men arrived at the Crawford ranch with an offer. Daniel was working in the corral when they rode up, well-armed and radiating casual menace. Their leader, a hard-faced man named Dalton, presented himself as Pemberton's business manager. "Mr. Crawford, I'm here to discuss a business proposition. Mr. Pemberton understands you filed some concerns about the toll road project. He'd like to resolve those concerns amicably. There's nothing to resolve. The objection stands." Dalton smiled without warmth. "Mr. Pemberton is prepared to offer you $5,000 to withdraw your objection. That's generous compensation for any inconvenience. We're not withdrawing. Perhaps you should discuss it with your wife before making hasty decisions. $5,000 could buy a lot of security for a couple living this far from civilization." The threat was barely veiled. Accidents happen on isolated ranches. Fires, raiders, unfortunate encounters with wildlife. Daniel's hand moved to his rifle. "You can tell Pemberton that threatening us only proves we're right to challenge him. Now get off my property." Dalton's companions shifted their positions, hands near weapons. For a tense moment, violence seemed inevitable. Then Sarah emerged from the cabin, holding not a weapon, but a notebook. "Mr. Dalton," she called out, "before you leave, you should know I've documented this entire conversation. I've also sent copies of our evidence to 3 separate lawyers in different territories, with instructions to forward everything to federal authorities if anything happens to us. Harming us won't stop the hearing. It will only add criminal charges to the existing corruption allegations." It was a bluff. They hadn't actually arranged such contingencies yet, but Dalton couldn't be certain. The calculus shifted. "Martyring the Crawfords might create more problems than it solved. You're making powerful enemies," Dalton said coldly. "We've survived worse," Sarah replied. After the men departed, Daniel found Sarah's hands shaking despite her brave performance. "We need to actually arrange those contingencies you mentioned." "Already composing the letters," Sarah said. "And Daniel, we need to accept that we're at war now. Montgomery and Pemberton won't stop with threats. They'll investigate us, dig into our past, try to find any weakness they can exploit, including your real identity. Especially that. If they can prove I'm Apache, they can potentially invalidate our legal standing and our marriage. Everything we've built could collapse." Daniel pulled her close. "Then we make sure they can't prove it. We've got documentation, community support, and the truth on our side regarding the land theft. That's what we focus on." But both knew the coming battle would test everything they'd created. The hearing in Tucson would determine not just the fate of Apache lands, but their own survival and the future of justice in a territory where corruption had become the accepted norm. As they prepared for the legal fight of their lives, neither suspected that the hearing would reveal something far larger than Pemberton's land grab, a conspiracy connecting territorial officials, federal appointees, and business interests in a network of corruption that stretched across multiple territories. The discovery that would change everything was just 2 weeks away. Tucson in June was a furnace. Heat radiated from adobe walls and dirt streets, turning the territorial capital into something that felt more like punishment than civilization. Daniel and Sarah arrived 2 days before the hearing, taking a room at a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Eleanor Chapman, who asked no uncomfortable questions about her guests' backgrounds. Benjamin Ross met them the evening before the hearing, his arms loaded with additional documents and the expression that mixed hope with realism. "I've been digging deeper into Pemberton's land acquisitions," Ross said, spreading papers across the small table in their room. "What I've found is worse than we suspected. Pemberton isn't the architect. He's just one operator in a much larger system." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, leaning forward to examine the documents. Ross pulled out a ledger he'd obtained through contacts Daniel didn't want to know about. "This is a record of land transactions across 5 different territories over the past 8 years. The pattern is identical everywhere. Apache land gets reclassified as surplus, sold at absurdly low prices to specific buyers, then quickly developed using territorial government contracts. The profits are staggering, but more importantly, the same names keep appearing as buyers across all 5 territories." Daniel scanned the names, recognizing several prominent businessmen and politicians. These men operate in different territories. How are they coordinating? That's the question that led me to this. Ross produced another document, a letter written on expensive stationery bearing no signature. "This was found in a batch of Pemberton's correspondence that my contact acquired. Read it." Sarah took the letter, her eyes widening as she read aloud. "Proceed with Arizona parcels as discussed. Governor Montgomery has been briefed on procedures. Expected returns should match Montana outcomes. Maintain standard documentation protocols to ensure legal insulation. Forward 20% to the usual account." "The usual account?" Daniel asked. "That's what caught my attention. I've traced similar references in documents from Montana, Wyoming, and New Mexico territories. Someone is orchestrating land theft across the entire western frontier, taking a percentage of every transaction. The territorial governors, the businessmen like Pemberton, they're all following instructions from whoever writes these letters." Sarah set down the letter, her mind visibly racing through implications. This isn't just corruption. This is organized conspiracy on a massive scale. Someone has created a system to systematically steal indigenous lands using legal mechanisms, and they're applying it territory by territory. "Who could coordinate something like this?" Daniel asked. "Who has that kind of reach?" Ross shook his head. "That I haven't determined. The letters are unsigned. The usual account is routed through multiple banks, making it nearly impossible to trace. Whoever's behind this has been very careful to stay hidden, but we have evidence of the conspiracy's existence," Sarah said, her legal mind focusing on what could be proven rather than what remained mysterious. "These documents show coordination across territories, systematic theft, and financial arrangements that violate multiple federal laws. They do, but they're also potentially inadmissible in tomorrow's hearing. Judge Cross will likely rule them irrelevant to the narrow question of whether the toll road reclassification followed proper procedures." "Then we make them relevant," Sarah said firmly. "We argue that the reclassification is part of a broader pattern of illegal activity, that approving it would make the court complicit in conspiracy. We force Cross to either acknowledge the larger corruption or explicitly choose to ignore it." Ross looked doubtful. "Cross is Montgomery's man. He'll choose to ignore it. Probably, but his choice will be on record. When we appeal to federal courts, we'll have documentation that territorial courts refuse to address evidence of systematic corruption. That strengthens our federal case immensely." Daniel watched his wife transform into something formidable, not the frightened woman he'd pulled from the desert, not even the careful homesteader maintaining a false identity, but a legal strategist preparing for intellectual combat. The mission school education, the years of studying white man's law, all of it was converging into this moment. The territorial courthouse was an imposing adobe structure that dominated Tucson's central plaza. When Daniel and Sarah arrived the next morning, they found the courtroom packed beyond capacity. Word of the hearing had spread, drawing Apache observers, settler businessmen, territorial officials, and curious citizens wanting to witness this unprecedented challenge to Montgomery's authority. Judge Nathan Cross presided from an elevated bench, his severe features and cold eyes making clear his disposition before proceedings even began. The territorial attorney, a polished man named Richard Blackwell, sat surrounded by assistants and stacks of documents. Sarah had only Benjamin Ross beside her and a single folder containing their evidence. The asymmetry was intentional, a visual representation that the territory's full resources were arrayed against two isolated citizens who had dared to question authority. Cross called the hearing to order, his voice carrying the bored efficiency of someone going through required motions. This court will hear arguments regarding the legal challenge filed by Mrs. Sarah Crawford concerning the proposed toll road through Section 47 of territorial lands, formerly designated as Apache Reservation Territory. Mrs. Crawford, you may present your opening argument. Sarah stood, and Daniel saw dozens of eyes fix upon her, some curious, some hostile, some calculating. She walked to the center of the courtroom with deliberate calm, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who belonged in this space, despite every social convention saying otherwise. Your Honor, the issue before this court is simple. Did the territorial government follow legally required procedures when reclassifying Apache treaty land for commercial development? The answer, based on evidence we will present, is definitively no. She began systematically outlining the legal violations, the lack of required congressional approval, the failure to provide notice to affected Apache communities, the absence of environmental assessments mandated by federal guidelines, the irregular timeline that suggested predetermined outcomes rather than genuine evaluation. Blackwell interrupted frequently with procedural objections, trying to disrupt Sarah's rhythm. But she handled each objection with practiced precision, citing relevant statutes and precedents that forced Cross to overrule most challenges. When Sarah introduced the documents Ross had obtained showing the broader pattern of land theft, Blackwell objected strenuously. Your Honor, Mrs. Crawford is attempting to introduce irrelevant material from other territories. This hearing concerns only the specific toll road proposal. Your Honor, Sarah countered, these documents establish pattern and intent. They show that the reclassification at issue isn't an isolated administrative action, but part of systematic conspiracy to violate federal treaties. The court cannot properly evaluate the legality of this reclassification without understanding the larger context. Cross's expression made clear he wanted to exclude the documents, but Sarah had framed her argument in terms that made exclusion legally questionable. After a long pause, he spoke. I'll allow limited introduction of contextual documents, but Mrs. Crawford, keep your arguments focused on the specific reclassification at issue. It was a partial victory. The documents were on record, even if Cross planned to ignore them. Sarah presented the ledgers, the unsigned letters, the financial records showing Pemberton's profits from previous land acquisitions. She connected, each piece methodically, building a narrative of corruption that filled the courtroom with uncomfortable silence. When she finished, the weight of evidence hung in the air, like an accusation no one wanted to address directly. Blackwell's counter-argument focused on technical compliance with territorial regulations, ignoring the federal treaty violations and the evidence of conspiracy. His presentation was polished but defensive, repeatedly asserting that Montgomery's administration had operated within its authority without meaningfully engaging with Sarah's evidence. During cross-examination, Sarah pressed hard. "Mr. Blackwell, you assert that territorial authority allows reclassification of Apache lands. Can you cite the federal statute granting that authority? Territorial Organic Acts provide governors with broad discretion over land management. Discretion bounded by federal treaty obligations, correct? The 1867 treaty with the Mescalero Apache explicitly guarantees the lands at issue. On what legal basis can territorial discretion override federal treaty?" Blackwell hesitated, then pivoted. "Apache violations of treaty terms voided territorial obligations. Please provide documentation of these alleged violations. It's well known that Apache raiders—" "Documentation, Mr. Blackwell, not assertions. This court requires evidence." Blackwell couldn't produce documentation because none existed. The claim of Apache treaty violations was propaganda rather than fact. Sarah had trapped him into either admitting the lack of evidence or continuing to make unsupported claims that undermined his credibility. Gross intervened before the damage worsened. "Mrs. Crawford, I think we've established the territorial position. Move on to other questions." But the damage was done. Sarah had demonstrated on record that the territorial government's justifications for land seizure rested on claims they couldn't substantiate. The hearing stretched across 2 full days. Sarah presented witness testimony from Apache families displaced by previous reclassifications, their stories painting human faces on bureaucratic theft. She introduced financial experts who explained how Pemberton's profits depended on purchasing land far below market value, profits only possible through government conspiracy. Throughout it all, Daniel watched his wife command the courtroom with authority that transcended her legal credentials. She was fighting not just for Apache lands, but for the principle that law should protect the vulnerable rather than enable their exploitation. On the second day's afternoon, something unexpected happened. A man Daniel didn't recognize approached during a recess, speaking quietly to Benjamin Ross. Ross's expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. When he pulled Sarah and Daniel aside, his voice was urgent. "That man is a clerk from the Territorial Land Office. He says he has documents proving Montgomery personally profited from land sales, including the parcels at issue in this case. He's willing to testify, but he's terrified. He says 3 other clerks who discovered similar information have died under suspicious circumstances in the past 2 years. Sarah's eyes locked onto the nervous clerk standing 20 feet away. "Will he testify today?" "He wants protection first. Federal protection, not territorial." Daniel made a decision. "I know Marshal Garrett is in Tucson. I saw him this morning. Let me approach him about protective custody for a witness." It took Daniel an hour to locate Garrett and explain the situation. The marshal listened with growing interest, then agreed. "If this clerk has evidence of criminal activity by territorial officials, he falls under federal jurisdiction. I can offer protection, but he needs to testify immediately before Montgomery learns about his defection." By late afternoon, the clerk, a slight man named Eugene Peters, sat in the witness chair, visibly trembling but determined. Sarah guided him through testimony that was devastating in its specificity. "Mr. Peters, in your capacity as senior clerk in the Territorial Land Office, did you have access to Governor Montgomery's correspondence regarding land transactions?" "Yes, ma'am. Part of my duties involved filing official documents." "And did you observe anything irregular in how those transactions were conducted?" "I observed that Governor Montgomery received payments from Mr. Pemberton and others totaling over $50,000 in the past year alone. Payments recorded as consulting fees, but clearly connected to land sales he approved." The courtroom erupted. Cross hammered his gavel, demanding order, but the revelation couldn't be contained. Sarah pressed forward while she had momentum. Do you have documentation of these payments? Peters produced a ledger from his jacket. This is a copy I made before destroying the originals as instructed. It shows every payment, every land parcel, every date. Governor Montgomery is personally profiting from selling Apache treaty land, Blackwell objected violently, claiming the testimony was beyond the scope of the hearing, demanding Peters be held in contempt for theft of government documents. But Sarah was ready. Your Honor, this testimony directly addresses the question of whether the reclassification followed proper procedures. It demonstrates that the procedures were corrupted from the outset by officials with financial incentives to approve the transactions, regardless of legality. Cross looked trapped. Excluding the testimony would be obvious bias, but allowing it meant acknowledging corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. After a long, tense silence, he spoke. The testimony is admitted into the record. However, I will note that allegations of impropriety do not themselves invalidate administrative actions taken within statutory authority. It was the compromise of a judge trying to serve two masters, acknowledging corruption while preparing to rule for the corrupt. But Sarah had achieved her objective. The evidence was on record. When federal courts reviewed this case, they would see that territorial courts had acknowledged corruption but refused to address it. Cross adjourned the hearing, promising a ruling within 1 week. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel found himself surrounded by Apache observers who had watched Sarah's performance with amazement. One elderly man approached, speaking in halting English. "You fight for us. Why white woman care about Apache land?" Sarah met his eyes, and Daniel saw her struggle with how to respond. She couldn't reveal her true identity, but she also couldn't dismiss the question. "Because justice should protect everyone," she said finally, "not just those with power and money." The old man studied her face with unsettling intensity, and Daniel wondered if he saw what the tracker had seen. Echoes of Apache heritage beneath the carefully maintained settler identity. But after a long moment, he simply nodded. "You have brave heart. Our people remember this." As they left the courthouse, Daniel felt the full weight of what they'd started. Win or lose the legal case, they'd exposed corruption that powerful people wanted hidden. Eugene Peters had testified despite knowing it might cost his life. Marshal Garrett had extended federal protection, marking himself as an obstacle to Montgomery's agenda. "We've started something we can't stop now," Daniel said as they walked back to the boarding house. "I know," Sarah replied, "and tomorrow Montgomery will begin fighting back with everything he has, including, probably, renewed investigation into who I really am." "Do you regret it?" Sarah looked at the setting sun, painting the desert in shades of red and gold. "No. For the first time since those arrows struck me, I feel like I'm living instead of just surviving. Whatever comes next, at least I'm fighting for something that matters." Daniel took her hand, and they walked through Tucson's dusty streets. Two people with everything to lose, but a cause worth losing it for. 1 week later, Judge Cross would issue his ruling, and everything would change again. Judge Cross's ruling arrived on a scorching afternoon, exactly 7 days after the hearing concluded. Daniel was repairing fence posts when he saw the rider approaching, a court messenger carrying official documents sealed with the territorial stamp. Sarah emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron, her face composed but her eyes betraying anxiety. The messenger handed over the envelope without ceremony and departed immediately, as if reluctant to be associated with whatever the documents contained. Sarah broke the seal with steady hands, while Daniel stood beside her, reading over her shoulder. The ruling was exactly what they'd expected and feared. Judge Cross acknowledged the evidence of corruption, but ruled that administrative irregularities didn't invalidate actions taken within statutory authority. The toll road project was approved. The Apache land reclassification would stand. Sarah's legal challenge was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it couldn't be refiled in territorial court. But the ruling contained something else, a final paragraph that made Daniel's blood run cold. This court notes with concern that Mrs. Sarah Crawford, though presenting herself as legal representative in this matter, has not demonstrated proper credentials to practice law in Arizona territory. Furthermore, questions have been raised regarding Mrs. Crawford's identity and legal status. This court recommends that territorial authorities conduct thorough investigation into Mrs. Crawford's background and credentials before she is permitted to file additional legal action. Sarah set down the papers, her face pale. He's opening the door for Montgomery to investigate me officially. This isn't just a legal defeat, it's a direct attack on our identity. Can they force an investigation without cause? They just created cause by questioning my credentials and identity in an official ruling. Cross gave Montgomery justification to examine every aspect of our lives. Her voice remained steady, but Daniel heard the fear beneath it. They'll request our marriage certificate, property records, correspondence, everything Benjamin Ross created for us. And they'll do it with the full authority of the territorial government behind them. Daniel pulled her close. Then we appeal to federal court like we planned. We get this out of territorial jurisdiction before Montgomery can act. Appeals take time. Months, maybe longer. Montgomery will move quickly. She was right. That evening, as if to confirm her prediction, Marshal Garrett arrived at their ranch with news that confirmed their worst fears. Montgomery has assigned Captain Hayes to conduct a formal investigation into your backgrounds, Garrett said, his expression grim. Hayes has been given broad authority, subpoena power, right to search property, ability to detain subjects for questioning. This isn't a casual inquiry. This is a determined effort to find something to use against you. When does it start? Daniel asked. It already has. Hayes sent requests to Philadelphia authorities asking for confirmation of Sarah's background records. He's also interviewing everyone in Copper Springs who knows you, asking about inconsistencies in your story, unusual behavior, anything that might suggest Sarah isn't who she claims to be. Sarah's jaw tightened. The Philadelphia records will check out. Ross ensured they were properly backdated and filed. But if Hayes interviews enough people, someone might mention something suspicious. My knowledge of Apache healing practices, the way I sometimes lapse into thought patterns that don't match Eastern upbringing. Small details that individually mean nothing but collectively paint a picture. Garrett leaned forward, his voice urgent. There's something else you need to know. Eugene Peters, the clerk who testified, was found dead this morning. Official report says he fell from his horse and struck his head on a rock. But the body showed signs of a struggle, and his saddlebags were missing, including documents he claimed to have as insurance. The casual brutality of it stunned Daniel. They murdered a federal witness in protective custody. Peters left the boarding house where I'd secured him, claiming he needed to retrieve additional evidence from his home. He never returned. I have suspicions, but no proof. Montgomery's people are professional enough to make murder look like accident, so we're fighting people who kill witnesses and face a system rigged against us, Sarah said. What do you suggest, Marshal? Garrett pulled an envelope from his jacket. I've been corresponding with a federal prosecutor in Santa Fe named James Mitchell. He's building a case against territorial corruption in New Mexico that has similarities to what you uncovered here. I've sent him copies of all the evidence from your hearing. Mitchell wants to meet with you. He believes your Arizona case could be connected to his New Mexico investigation. You think it's the same conspiracy? Daniel asked. I think someone is orchestrating land theft across multiple territories using identical methods. If Mitchell can prove systematic conspiracy involving federal appointees, territorial governors, that becomes a federal crime prosecutable in Washington. That gets you out from under Montgomery's jurisdiction entirely. Sarah's legal mind immediately grasped the implications. If we're cooperating with federal investigation, Montgomery can't simply arrest us without appearing to obstruct federal authority. We'd have protection. Exactly. But you'd need to travel to Santa Fe to meet Mitchell and provide testimony. That means leaving Arizona, potentially for weeks. Are you willing to take that risk? Daniel and Sarah exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Leaving meant abandoning the ranch temporarily, trusting that Garrett and others could protect it from Montgomery's retaliation. But staying meant waiting for Hayes's investigation to inevitably uncover something. If not truth, then manufactured evidence sufficient to destroy them. "We'll go," Daniel said. "When?" "Tomorrow, if possible." "The faster you connect with Mitchell, the faster you gain federal protection." After Garrett departed, Daniel and Sarah spent the evening preparing. They packed essential documents, including all the evidence they'd compiled. Sarah wrote letters to the women's group in Copper Springs, explaining they were traveling on urgent family business, maintaining the fiction, even as they feared it might soon be irrelevant. As darkness fell, Sarah stood at the window staring out at the desert that had almost killed her 4 years earlier. "Daniel, we need to discuss what happens if the truth comes out. If Hayes proves I'm Apache, our marriage could be declared invalid. You could face prison for harboring me, for the fraud we've committed. We committed no fraud. We built a life together based on genuine partnership. Documents don't define what we are to each other. The law disagrees. Under territorial regulations, Apache individuals can't legally marry white citizens. A marriage would be void, meaning you'd have no legal protection against charges of cohabitation with a native woman outside marriage. That's a federal crime." Daniel turned her to face him. "Then we make sure the truth doesn't come out. And if it does, we face those consequences together. I knew the risks when I pulled you from that desert. I knew them when we married. I'd make the same choices again, even if it costs you everything." "You are everything. The ranch, the reputation, the legal safety, those are just circumstances. You're what matters." Sarah's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "How did I get so fortunate to be found by you? Out of all the people who could have ridden past that mesquite bush, it was someone who would risk everything. Rebel found you. I just listened to my horse." Despite the gravity of their situation, Sarah laughed. "Then I owe that stallion more gratitude than any animal has ever deserved." They departed before dawn, taking Rebel and a pack horse loaded with supplies. The journey to Santa Fe would require 2 weeks of hard travel through territory that was increasingly hostile. Apache raids had intensified in response to continued treaty violations, and the Army's indiscriminate retaliation meant any Apache individual found off-reservation risked summary execution. For Sarah, traveling meant accepting that exposure could come from any direction: soldiers, settlers, or Apache raiders who might recognize her despite her settler clothing and altered identity. 3 days into their journey, the danger materialized. They were following a narrow canyon trail when riders appeared ahead, 5 Apache warriors blocking the path. Daniel's hand moved toward his rifle, but Sarah stopped him with a gesture. "Don't. We're outnumbered, and they haven't attacked yet. Let me try to talk." She urged her horse forward slowly, hands visible and empty. The lead warrior was young, perhaps 25, with fierce eyes that studied Sarah with intense curiosity. When he spoke, it was in Apache, words that Daniel couldn't understand, but whose tone suggested questions rather than threats. Sarah responded in English. "I don't speak Apache. My husband and I are traveling to Santa Fe on business." "We mean no harm to your people." The warrior switched to heavily accented English. "You lie. Your face carries Apache blood even if your tongue speaks white words. I know your grandmother's line. You are daughter of White Horse family." Daniel felt the world tilt. This was the moment they'd feared, confronted by someone who could see through their carefully constructed identity with certainty no documents could overcome. But Sarah's response surprised Daniel. She didn't deny the accusation. Instead, she spoke truth wrapped in careful context. "I was born to the White Horse family, but that woman died 4 years ago, killed by her own people for crimes she didn't commit. I survived because this man," she gestured to Daniel, "chose compassion over law. The woman I am now exists because he gave me a second chance at life." I will not betray that gift by pretending it didn't happen. The warrior studied her silently, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke. Your husband shot arrows. They say you betrayed your marriage for a Mexican trader. They lied. But Thomas Whitehorse believed them because his brother wanted my father's horses. I was punished for a crime that existed only in his imagination. And now you ride with white man, dressed as white woman, speaking white man's law against white man's theft of our lands. The warrior's tone carried no judgment, only observation. You have become something new, not Apache, not white. Something between. I'm trying to help, Sarah said quietly. Using the weapons white society values, law, documentation, testimony, to fight theft they won't acknowledge when Apache people object. I can't undo what was done to me, but I can try to prevent it happening to others. The warrior conferred with his companions in rapid Apache. Daniel's hand remained near his rifle, ready but not threatening. After a long moment, the lead warrior turned back to Sarah. We will not harm you or reveal you. What you are doing, fighting white man's theft with white man's law, this is warrior's work using new weapons. My grandmother would say you honor our people by surviving and fighting, even if the way you fight would confuse our ancestors. He gestured to his warriors, and they parted, creating a clear path through the canyon. As Daniel and Sarah rode past, the warrior spoke once more. But Sarah Whitehorse, daughter of Mountain Shadow, wife of no one, know that you walk a dangerous path between worlds. One day you will have to choose which world claims you. When that day comes, remember you still have family among our people, family who would welcome you home if you desired it. They rode on in silence until the warriors disappeared behind them. Only then did Sarah release the breath she'd been holding. That was the second time someone from your past has recognized you, Daniel said. How many more are out there? I don't know. But what he said about choosing between worlds, he's right. I can't remain suspended between identities forever. Eventually, circumstances will force me to be either Sarah Crawford or Sarah Whitehorse. I can't be both. Which would you choose? Sarah looked at him with profound sadness. I don't know. Sarah Whitehorse is who I was born to be, but she died in the desert. Sarah Crawford is who I've become, but she's built on necessary lies. I love the life we've created, but I miss the connection to my people, my culture, my true history. Choosing either means betraying the other. Daniel had no answer. The question Sarah faced transcended their immediate legal troubles. It was a question of identity itself, whether survival required the complete erasure of one's true self, or whether some way existed to honor both the past and the present without destroying either. They reached Santa, 11 days after leaving Arizona, exhausted but unharmed. Federal prosecutor James Mitchell met them at a small office near the territorial courthouse, his expression grave as he reviewed the evidence they'd brought. This is even more comprehensive than Garrett indicated, Mitchell said, spreading documents across his desk. You've documented systematic land fraud, bribery of territorial officials, and conspiracy involving multiple territories. This is exactly what I need to elevate my New Mexico case to federal jurisdiction. Can you protect us from Montgomery's investigation? Daniel asked. I can offer limited protection. Once you're cooperating witnesses in a federal investigation, Montgomery risks federal obstruction charges if he interferes with you. But Sarah, I need to be direct. If Hayes discovers irregularities in your background documentation, I can't shield you from those charges. Federal witness protection doesn't extend to identity fraud, even if the fraud was necessary to survive, Sarah asked. Mitchell's expression was sympathetic but firm. I understand there may be complicated circumstances, but the law doesn't generally recognize necessity as justification for sustained identity fraud. If your documentation is challenged successfully, I can argue for leniency based on your cooperation, but I can't prevent prosecution. It was the honest assessment they'd feared. They had gained federal interest in the corruption case, but their personal vulnerability remained. How long before you can move forward with federal charges? Sarah asked. I need to coordinate with prosecutors in other territories, compile evidence from multiple jurisdictions, and convince the Attorney General's office that this warrants federal intervention. Realistically, 3 to 6 months before formal charges are filed. That's a long time to remain exposed, Daniel observed. I know, but building a case of this magnitude requires patience and thoroughness. If we move too quickly, we risk Montgomery's lawyers finding procedural grounds for dismissal. We need this to be airtight. As they left Mitchell's office, Daniel felt the weight of uncertainty settling over them. They had allies, evidence, and a path forward, but that path required navigating months of danger while Montgomery and Hayes worked to destroy them. We can't go back to the ranch, Sarah said as they walked Santa Fe's streets. Hayes will be waiting for us there with questions we can't answer. Where do we go? Somewhere we can continue gathering evidence while staying ahead of Montgomery's investigation. Somewhere we can build a case so strong that when the truth about my identity emerges, and it will emerge, eventually, the good we've accomplished outweighs the fraud we've committed. Daniel understood what she was proposing. Instead of hiding and waiting for federal prosecutors to act, they would become active investigators themselves, gathering evidence from other territories, building the conspiracy case into something undeniable. It meant life as fugitives, constantly moving, always looking over their shoulders. But it also meant taking control of their destiny, rather than waiting passively for others to determine their fate. Then that's what we'll do, Daniel said. We'll build a case that forces the truth to matter more than the lies. Neither of them knew that their investigation would uncover something far more sinister than land fraud, a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of federal government and threatened not just Apache lands, but the integrity of Western territorial governance itself. The fight was just beginning, and the real architect of the conspiracy was still hidden, watching their every move and preparing to eliminate the threat they represented. Over the following 4 months, Daniel and Sarah became ghosts moving through the Western territories. They traveled from Montana to New Mexico, from Colorado to Nevada, following the trail of land fraud that Mitchell's investigation had identified. In each location, they found the same pattern: Apache lands reclassified, sold at fraudulent prices to connected businessmen, profits funneling through anonymous accounts. But they also found something else: witnesses. Clerks like Eugene Peters, who had seen too much and lived in fear. Displaced Apache families who had lost everything to legal theft. Honest officials who had been pushed aside or threatened when they questioned the system. Sarah and Daniel documented every testimony, preserved every piece of evidence, and sent regular reports to Mitchell in Santa Fe. Their work was dangerous. In Colorado, they narrowly escaped an ambush by men they couldn't prove were connected to the conspiracy. In Montana, their hotel room was searched while they attended a meeting. Someone was tracking their movements, trying to determine what they knew and who they'd spoken with. Through it all, Sarah maintained her identity as Sarah Crawford. But the strain of constant performance was taking its toll. Each new territory brought risk of recognition. Each Apache community they interviewed carried the possibility that someone would see through her disguise. It was in a small Nevada mining town called Silver Ridge that everything finally came together and fell apart. They were interviewing a former territorial land office clerk named Margaret Williams, a widow who had kept copies of suspicious transactions before being forced from her position. As Margaret laid out documents showing Nevada's role in the conspiracy, she mentioned something that made Sarah go still. "There was one letter that frightened me more than the others," Margaret said, pulling out a yellowed envelope. "It came directly to the governor's desk, marked confidential. I was filing it and saw the signature before the governor snatched it away. But I remembered the name because it was so unusual. Cornelius Ashford." "Ashford," Daniel repeated, the name triggering recognition. Robert Ashford was the federal surveyor who witnessed Hope. He caught himself. Who witnessed events at Jackson Ward's ranch in that story from back east? Not Robert, Cornelius. but it might be related. Cornelius Ashford is a senior official in the Department of Interior in Washington. He oversees territorial land policy for the entire western region. Sarah's face went pale. A Department of Interior official orchestrating land fraud. That's not just territorial corruption. That's federal conspiracy at the highest levels. Margaret nodded grimly. Cornelius Ashford has authority to approve or reject land reclassifications across all Western territories. He's the one person who could coordinate this kind of systematic theft because he controls the federal approval process. Governors like Montgomery are following his instructions, sharing profits with him in exchange for his official approvals. Daniel felt the scope of what they'd uncovered crystallize into terrible clarity. This wasn't multiple separate conspiracies, it was a single, coordinated operation run from Washington by someone with power to manipulate the entire territorial system. "We need to get this information to Mitchell immediately," Sarah said. "If we can prove a Department of Interior official is orchestrating the conspiracy, federal prosecutors can't ignore it." But as they left Margaret's house, Daniel noticed something wrong. 3 men stood at the end of the street, watching them with obvious purpose. More men appeared at the opposite end, blocking their escape route. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered. The men approached in a coordinated movement, not rushing, but advancing with the confidence of people who knew their quarry had nowhere to run. The leader was Dalton, Pemberton's enforcer from Arizona, and his presence here meant Montgomery's network knew exactly where they were. "Mr. and Mrs. Crawford," Dalton said, his voice carrying mock courtesy, "you've been very difficult to locate these past months. Governor Montgomery would like a word. You can come peacefully, or we can make this unpleasant." Daniel's hand moved toward his concealed pistol, but Dalton was faster, drawing his own weapon with practiced ease. "Don't be foolish. We have you surrounded, and we have orders to bring you back alive." But alive doesn't mean unharmed. They were disarmed and forced into a covered wagon, their hands bound and mouths gagged. As the wagon rolled out of Silver Ridge heading south toward Arizona, Daniel caught Sarah's eyes across the darkness. He saw fear there, but also determination. They had uncovered the truth about Cornelius Ashford, and somehow they needed to ensure that information reached Mitchell even if they didn't survive to deliver it personally. The journey back to Arizona took 5 days. They were kept bound and guarded constantly, allowed minimal food and water, treated like cargo rather than people. When the wagon finally stopped, Daniel heard voices and recognized where they'd been taken, not to a jail or courthouse, but to a remote ranch house that served as Pemberton's private headquarters. They were dragged into a large room where Governor Montgomery waited, along with Marcus Pemberton, Captain Hayes, and several other men Daniel recognized as powerful territorial officials. This wasn't a legal proceeding. It was something far more sinister. Montgomery approached Sarah first, studying her with cold calculation. "Mrs. Crawford, or should I say Mrs. Whitehorse? Yes, Captain Hayes's investigation has been quite revealing. Sarah Whitehorse, missing Apache woman, presumed dead for 4 years. Imagine our surprise to discover you've been living as a white settler woman, married to Daniel Crawford in a union that's not only fraudulent, but federally illegal." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "You can prove nothing that will stand up in federal court, perhaps. But I don't need federal courts. I have territorial authority, and you've broken territorial laws. Fraud, identity theft, violation of Apache confinement regulations, illegal marriage. I could have you imprisoned for 20 years on those charges alone, but you won't," Sarah said, her legal mind working despite their desperate situation. "Because prosecuting me means holding a public trial where all the evidence we've gathered about your corruption becomes part of the official record. You can't afford that exposure." Montgomery's smile was cold. "Quite right. Which is why you're not going to trial. You're going to disappear. A tragic accident in the desert, perhaps. Apache raiders attacking isolated travelers. So many dangers on the frontier." Daniel felt rage building in his chest. "You're planning to murder us." I'm planning to solve a problem, Montgomery corrected. You've been gathering evidence against me and my associates for months. You've connected with federal prosecutors, interviewed witnesses, built a case that could destroy everything we've worked to create. That makes you more than a nuisance. You're an existential threat. Killing us won't stop the investigation, Sarah said. Federal Prosecutor Mitchell has copies of everything we've discovered. Mitchell has documents. But documents without witnesses to authenticate them, without investigators to testify about their provenance, become much less useful. And Mitchell will discover that pursuing his investigation too aggressively might result in his own unfortunate accident. The threat was explicit. They were prepared to kill not just Daniel and Sarah, but any federal official who got too close to exposing them. Pemberton spoke for the first time. This didn't have to end this way. We offered you money, offered to leave you alone if you'd simply withdrawn your challenge. Your stubbornness created this outcome. Our stubbornness? Sarah's voice carried steel. You're stealing millions of acres of land from people who have no legal recourse. You're destroying communities, breaking federal treaties, murdering witnesses. And you call us stubborn for objecting? I call you naive, Pemberton replied. This is how the frontier works. Power takes what it wants and dresses it up in legal language. You thought you could change that with evidence and testimony, but power doesn't yield to paper. It yields only to superior power. Then we'll find superior power, Daniel said. Montgomery laughed. You're a minor rancher with a fraudulent wife. You have no power, no influence, no resources. You're about to disappear into the desert, and no one will ever know what happened to you. But Montgomery had made a critical miscalculation. He had assumed Daniel and Sarah were alone, isolated, without allies or backup plans. He hadn't considered that months of traveling through territories, interviewing witnesses, and building relationships had created a network that extended far beyond their immediate presence as Montgomery began giving orders to his men to prepare. For the Crawfords' disposal, the ranch house door burst open. Marshal Thomas Garrett entered with a dozen federal marshals, weapons drawn and badges visible. Governor Montgomery, you and everyone in this room are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, witness intimidation, and violation of federal territorial governance statutes. Montgomery's face went white. You have no authority here. This is territorial jurisdiction. Actually, came a new voice from behind Garrett. Federal jurisdiction supersedes territorial authority when federal officials are investigating crimes that cross territorial boundaries. James Mitchell stepped into the room, carrying a leather folder stuffed with documents. Governor Montgomery, Marcus Pemberton, Captain Hayes, you're all named in federal indictments for conspiracy to defraud the United States government, bribery of federal officials, and systematic violation of federal treaty obligations. Your territorial authority means nothing against federal warrants, but the most shocking entrance came last. An older man in expensive Washington attire entered, flanked by additional federal agents. He was distinguished, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to power, and he was someone Daniel recognized from the photograph Margaret Williams had shown them. Cornelius Ashford, Sarah breathed. Actually, the man said, his voice carrying cultured authority, I'm Robert Ashford, Cornelius's younger brother and Deputy Director of the Department of Interior's Office of Territorial Affairs. My brother has been under federal investigation for 9 months, ever since your hearing in Tucson produced evidence that caught the attention of officials in Washington. Your work these past months has been instrumental in building our case. Daniel's mind reeled. You've been tracking our investigation. More than tracking it, facilitating it. Every witness you interviewed, we interviewed afterward. Every document you secured, we verified. You've been unknowingly working as field investigators for a federal operation that spans 6 territories and involves dozens of corrupt officials. Montgomery's face cycled through shock, rage, and finally resignation as he realized how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. Robert Ashford continued, My brother Cornelius used his position in the Department of Interior to orchestrate land fraud across the Western Territories for over a decade. He enriched himself and his associates by over $3 million while displacing thousands of families and violating countless federal treaties. But he was clever enough to stay hidden behind layers of bureaucratic authority and anonymous communications, until you two began connecting patterns that federal investigators had missed. How did you know to follow us? Sarah asked. Marshal Garrett contacted me after your Tucson hearing. He suspected the corruption extended beyond Arizona and wanted federal involvement. I reviewed the evidence you'd presented and realized it matched patterns we'd been investigating in other territories. Rather than interfering with your work, we let you continue while providing discreet protection and following up on your leads. Eugene Peters, Daniel said, understanding. His death wasn't Montgomery's men. It was staged to make them think they'd silenced a witness while you moved him to federal protection. Garrett nodded. Peters is alive and well in Washington, providing testimony against Cornelius Ashford and everyone involved in the conspiracy. His death served multiple purposes. It made the conspirators feel safe while preventing them from targeting other witnesses. Montgomery found his voice. This is entrapment. You allowed crimes to continue while conducting your investigation. We documented crimes already committed, Robert Ashford corrected. And we prevented the greatest crime, your planned murder of federal witnesses. Everyone in this room who participated in planning the Crawfords' deaths is now charged with attempted murder of federal cooperating witnesses, which carries mandatory life imprisonment. The men who had seemed so powerful minutes earlier now stood facing federal agents and certain conviction. The conspiracy that had operated for years with impunity had been dismantled by the evidence two ordinary people had painstakingly compiled. But Robert Ashford's expression grew serious as he turned to Sarah. However, we have a complicated situation regarding your legal status. Captain Hayes's investigation did reveal that your identity documentation contains irregularities. You are, in fact, Sarah Whitehorse, Apache woman who disappeared 4 years ago. Your marriage to Daniel Crawford is technically invalid under territorial regulations, and you've committed identity fraud. The room fell silent. After everything they'd accomplished, Sarah still faced prosecution for the fraud necessary to her survival. I'm recommending to the Attorney General that charges be dismissed based on extraordinary circumstances. And your invaluable contribution to this investigation, Robert Ashford continued, but that requires your full cooperation, including testimony about how you came to create a false identity and why it was necessary. Sarah stood straighter despite her bound hands. I'll provide whatever testimony you need, but I want to make something clear. I'm not ashamed of what I did. I survived attempted murder by my own people. I was helped by a man who chose compassion over law. We built a life together based on genuine partnership. If that's a crime, then your laws are more criminal than my actions. I don't disagree, Robert Ashford said quietly, which is why I'm also recommending comprehensive review of territorial regulations regarding Apache citizenship and marriage rights. Laws that force people to choose between survival and legal compliance are unjust laws that deserve revision. He gestured to Garrett, who cut their bonds. For now, you're both free. You'll need to remain available for testimony as these cases proceed through federal courts, but you're not under arrest. Your federal witness is under protection, which means Montgomery and his associates can't touch you. As federal marshals began arresting Montgomery, Pemberton, Hayes, and the others, Daniel pulled Sarah close. They had survived. More than survived, they had exposed a conspiracy that would result in land restoration for thousands of displaced families and prosecution of officials who had believed themselves above the law. But Sarah's identity was now known. The careful fiction they'd maintained for 4 years had been destroyed. What happens now? Sarah asked Robert Ashford. Everyone knows who I really am. That's up to you. Ashford replied. "You can reclaim your Apache identity if you choose. You can maintain your settler identity with documentation that acknowledges its complex origins. Or you can work with us to create new legal frameworks that recognize people like you, individuals who exist between worlds and deserve recognition in both." Over the following months, as trials proceeded and convictions accumulated, Sarah and Daniel worked with federal officials to document not just the corruption they'd uncovered, but the broader injustices that made such corruption possible. Their testimony helped convict Cornelius Ashford, Montgomery, Pemberton, and dozens of other conspirators. Land was restored to Apache communities across 6 territories. Treaties were reinforced with new protections. But more importantly, Sarah became something unprecedented, a legal advocate who openly acknowledged her Apache heritage while fighting within the American legal system for indigenous rights. Her existence challenged assumptions about who could represent Native peoples, who deserved citizenship, who had standing to challenge injustice. The ranch they returned to was the same physical space, but everything else had changed. Sarah no longer hid her knowledge of Apache healing practices or her fluent command of the language she'd once pretended not to speak. Daniel no longer worried about protecting a secret that had defined their lives for years. On a cool evening, 1 year after Montgomery's arrest, Sarah stood at the canyon edge where Daniel had found her dying 5 years earlier. The sun painted the desert in brilliant colors, and somewhere in the distance, an eagle called. Daniel joined her, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "Do you regret it?" Daniel finally asked. "Everything that happened, the fear, the hiding, the danger?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "I regret the necessity of it. I regret that survival required denying who I was. But I don't regret surviving. I don't regret meeting you. And I don't regret that our story helped change laws that needed changing. What would you tell the woman I pulled from this canyon 5 years ago? If you could speak to her in that moment, I'd tell her that dying wasn't her only option, that somewhere ahead, beyond pain and fear and impossible choices, there was a life worth fighting for, a partnership worth preserving, and a chance to ensure that other women wouldn't have to choose between their identity and their survival." Daniel took her hand. "And I'd tell the man who found you that saving your life was the beginning of everything that mattered, that compassion isn't weakness, that choosing humanity over law sometimes creates justice more profound than any court could mandate." They stood together as darkness fell across the desert, 2 people who had bridged impossible divides and changed the frontier forever. Their story would be told for generations, not as legend, but as testimony to what becomes possible when survival transforms into purpose, when injustice meets determination, and when a simple act of compassion ripples forward to reshape the very systems that tried to destroy the people it should have protected. Sarah Whitehorse Crawford had died in the desert and been reborn through Daniel's choice. But what she had become in the years since transcended either identity. She was proof that justice could be fought for, that corruption could be exposed, and that people caught between worlds could forge new paths that honored both while belonging entirely to neither. The frontier would continue changing, but their legacy remained, a testament to the power of 2 people who refused to accept that survival required surrendering either truth or conscience, and who proved that sometimes the greatest acts of justice begin with the smallest acts of compassion. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.